Welcome, dear listener. The night is here, and the day has ended. Your body rests, your breathing slows, and your thoughts begin to soften. You are safe now, wrapped in calm, ready for gentle dreams. Tonight, I will take you on a slow journey through the streets of ancient Rome. But this will not be about emperors, soldiers, or famous battles. Instead, we will walk quietly past the ordinary people who worked in strange, difficult, and unusual jobs. Some of these jobs were dirty. Some were tiring. Some were strange beyond belief. You would not want to do them yourself. But for those in ancient Rome, they were simply daily life. Every strange task had a worker behind it, earning coins, providing a service, and surviving. We will move slowly, one job at a time, exploring what it felt like, smelled like, and looked like. This will not be rushed. Every detail will be soft, gentle, and calming. So close your eyes now. Imagine the stone streets of Rome beneath your feet. Feel the warm evening air drifting through the city. Listen to the faint sound of voices, footsteps, and water trickling through aqueducts. We will explore the strange jobs of Rome together, slowly, calmly, until sleep takes you. Section 1. The Fullers, Stompers of Urine-Soaked Cloth. Imagine for a moment that you are walking down a narrow Roman street in the early morning. The stones beneath your feet are still damp with dew, and the air is filled with the mixed scents of bread baking in nearby ovens, smoke from household fires, and something far less pleasant, the sharp, sour odor of urine. Follow that scent, and it will lead you not to a waste heap, but to one of the most important workplaces in the entire Roman economy, the fuller's workshop. Fullers were, in simple words, the cleaners and refreshers of clothing. But unlike a modern laundry filled with fresh detergent, soft fabric softener, and humming machines, their tools were tubs, vats, and buckets filled with human and animal urine. The Romans discovered that the ammonia in urine acted as a natural cleaning agent. It broke down grease and dirt, stripped away oils, and brightened the appearance of fabric. So instead of soap, they relied on what the streets of Rome provided in abundance: waste. To supply the fullers, Romans were encouraged to deposit their urine in large clay jars placed at street corners. These jars, called piss pots, were collected daily by workers and carried to the fuller's workshop. Imagine the sight: men lifting heavy jars of yellow liquid, sloshing as they walk, and pouring them into great stone vats. It may sound unpleasant to us, but to the Romans, it was simply part of city life. The Emperor Vespasian even taxed the collection of urine, turning this strange practice into a source of stale revenue. His son once mocked him for it, but Vespasian simply held up a coin and said, "Money does not stink." Inside the workshop, the air was thick. The vats were lined up, filled with urine diluted with water. Rolls of wool, tunics, and togas were lowered in, their fibers absorbing the liquid. This was where the fullers themselves went to work. They would remove their footwear, tuck up their tunics, and climb barefoot into the vats. There, they began the slow, repetitive task of stomping on the cloth. Step after step, pressing and shifting, twisting and grinding the fabric beneath their feet. It was not violent or rushed, just steady, rhythmic movement, hour after hour, as if dancing in a very peculiar ritual. The sound filled the room: the slap of wet cloth, the splash of liquid, the shuffle of many feet. Light filtered dimly through high windows, catching the mist rising from the warm mixture. The smell, sharp and sour, clung to every surface. And yet, The work was necessary. This was the only way to keep garments bright, clean, and respectable in a society where appearance mattered deeply. Roman citizens judged one another by their clothing. A toga was not simply fabric. It was a symbol of status, of belonging, of Roman identity itself. To wear a dirty, oily, or stained garment was shameful. Fullers provided the essential service of keeping garments dignified, white, and presentable. After stomping, the fabric would be lifted out, heavy and dripping, and passed along to be rinsed in clean water. Then it was brushed, beaten, and stretched on wooden frames. To finish, sulfur was sometimes burned beneath the cloth to whiten it further, the fumes seeping upward to bleach the fibers. But the life of a fuller was not an easy one. Their bodies were soaked daily in pungent liquid. Their skin often cracked and stung from the ammonia. Their hair carried the odor home with them, no matter how much they tried to wash it away. They were sometimes mocked in the streets for their smell, and yet society relied on them completely. Close your eyes now and imagine standing in the workshop, not as a worker, but as a calm observer. You notice the rhythm of the feet moving in unison, almost like a strange meditation. Step, press, turn. Step, press, turn. The pattern is steady, almost soothing if you forget what they are standing in. The workers hum softly to themselves, filling the air with low tones that blend with the splashing water. There is a sense of routine, of acceptance, of life continuing as it always has. When the day's work ended, the fullers would step out of the vats, their skin wrinkled and tender, their garments clinging damply. The clean fabrics, however, gleamed whiter, brighter, and ready to be worn again. The Roman elite might never think about the toil that went into their spotless garments, but every clean toga on the streets was a silent testimony to the fuller's labor. And so, the next time you imagine Rome in all its marble splendor, remember that beneath that polished surface was a world of smells, stains, and sweat. The fullers kept the city presentable, though their work was hidden in shadowy workshops, far from the glitter of temples and forums. They were, in every sense, the invisible keepers of Roman dignity. As you walk away from the fuller's shop, the odor lingers faintly in your memory, but the fresh evening air begins to wash it away. The streets open before you, calm and quiet. You feel grateful not to be one of those workers, though you understand their importance. Step by step, you leave the heavy scent behind, and with each breath, you feel lighter, calmer, and more at ease. Our journey has only just begun. The next job will be no less strange, no less livid, and perhaps even more unsettling. But for now, rest in the knowledge that Rome's beauty depended on labor that was often hidden, humble, and difficult. Section 2. The Tanners, Masters of Skins and Stench. After leaving behind the fuller's workshop, where garments were purified in urine and stomped clean by weary feet, our path through Rome's hidden professions leads us to another place, equally vital, equally unpleasant, and perhaps even harder to endure, the tannery. If the fuller's art was about restoring beauty to cloth, the tanner's craft was about transforming something raw and repulsive into something lasting and useful. Leather was everywhere in Rome. Shoes, belts, armor straps, saddles, scabbards, tents, even the thongs that tied together everyday items, all required strong, durable leather. Yet leather did not simply appear ready for use. It began as skin, freshly removed from the body of an animal. The task of turning this bloody, slippery hide into smooth, supple material fell to the tanners. Imagine standing at the gates of a Roman tannery, the smell reaches you before anything else. A pungent combination of rotting flesh, animal fat, and acrid chemicals drifts through the air, clinging to the nostrils, impossible to escape. Unlike the clean white marble of temples or the polished mosaics of villas, this place feels darker, rougher, and pushed to the edges of the city. For good reason, too. The smell was considered so unbearable that tanneries were often located far from neighborhoods, near rivers where water could be drawn to wash away the mess. Step inside, and you would see animal skins piled high. Some were fresh and bloody, recently stripped from cattle, goats, or sheep at the butchers. Others were already stretched on wooden frames, drying stiffly in the sun. Workers moved among them, their hands rough and red from constant exposure to brine, lime, and other harsh substances. These men were not celebrated artisans. They were the laborers whose bodies absorbed the very stink of their work, making them unwelcome in polite society. The process of tanning began with cleaning. Skins were soaked in vats of water, mixed with lime, which loosened the hair and softened the flesh. The workers scraped away fur and fat with knives, bending over their frames for hours at a time. The sound of blade against hide, a rhythmic scraping, echoed through the space. When one hide was done, another was waiting, and another after that. The work was endless, for the demand for leather never ceased. But the worst part was still to come. To preserve the hides, Romans used a mixture of natural substances that today might make us shudder. Dog dung, bird droppings, and once again, urine were essential ingredients in the tanning process. The skins were soaked in these mixtures for days, sometimes weeks, allowing the chemicals to penetrate and prevent decay. Workers stirred the hides with poles, or waded in with their bare arms, moving the skins through the thick, foul-smelling sludge. Each breath filled their lungs with the acrid scent of decomposition mixed with excrement. And yet, out of this revolting process emerged something extraordinary. Slowly, the stiff raw hide transformed into pliable leather. It grew softer, more flexible, ready to be shaped into sandals that would walk the streets of Rome, or belts that would hold a soldier's sword in place. The final product was strong, durable, and essential to daily life. Without leather, much of Rome's economy, military, and household life would falter. Still, the life of a tanner was a hard one. Their work marked them. The smell clung to their skin and hair so stubbornly that no amount of washing could erase it. Other Romans avoided them, wrinkling their noses when they passed. Some considered them almost untouchable, as though the filth of their craft made them less human. But they endured, because their labor was necessary, and their pay, though modest, kept their families fed. Picture, if you will, the tanner at the end of a long day. His hands are raw, the skin between his fingers cracked from lime. His tunic is stained, stiff with the residue of hides. He steps out of the tannery, and though he longs for clean air, the odor follows him like a shadow. At home, his family is used to it, but neighbors might close their doors when he passes. Still, when a Roman soldier marches proudly in his sturdy leather sandals, or a wealthy merchant rides with goods tied in leather thongs, they owe part of their comfort and success to this overlooked, smelly profession. There is, oddly enough, a kind of rhythm and peace in this unpleasant craft. The steady scrape of knives against hide, the regular stirring of vats, the repetition of stretching and softening. It becomes almost meditative if one listens closely. The workers move in cycles, day after day, their lives bound to the transformation of skin into something useful. To them, the stench is simply the smell of survival, of work, of life. As you walk away from the tannery, the smell still clings faintly to your clothes, but the sound of the river nearby soothes your mind. The water flows endlessly, carrying away the waste, whispering a reminder that even in filth there is purpose. Rome's grandeur was built not only by marble carvers and statesmen, but also by men who endured the stink of hides and the weight of society's disdain. The tanners, much like the fullers, remind us that civilization rests on unglamorous shoulders. Every step in leather, every strap that held armor secure, every tent that sheltered travelers, these were born from a trade most Romans preferred not to think about. And yet, without it, their world would collapse. So let the smell drift away in your memory, leaving behind only calm understanding. We move onward, deeper into the forgotten trades of ancient Rome. And the next profession may be stranger still. Section 3. The gutter cleaners and latrine workers. If Rome prided itself on gleaming marble, soaring aqueducts, and streets paved in straight, ordered lines, there was always another side of the city, hidden beneath, running alongside, or lingering in dark corners. For every forum or bathhouse, there was also a gutter. For every aqueduct carrying clean water into the city, there was a drain carrying filth away. And to keep this immense system moving, Rome relied on some of the least envied workers of all, the gutter cleaners and the men who tended its communal latrines. Imagine yourself in the early hours of dawn, when the city still lies hushed and shadows drape the narrow lanes. Most people are still asleep in their insulae, the tall, crowded apartment blocks. The streets are not yet bustling with vendors and carts, but somewhere, at the edges of alleys or near the mouths of drains, figures begin their work. These are the men whose lives revolved around Rome's waste. The gutters themselves were deceptively simple. Small stone channels lined the edges of streets, designed to carry away rainwater, household runoff, and less pleasant substances poured out from windows and doorways above. By day, residents might toss out scraps of food, spoiled wine, or even chamber pot contents, calling a quick warning to those below. By night, these gutters filled, choked, and festered. Without attention, the flow stopped, and filth gathered. Rats came. The stench grew. And so the cleaners came, armed with little more than shovels, buckets, and their own endurance. They waded into muck, scraping and scooping, hauling away what others discarded without a thought. The sound of their work was not glamorous. The wet slap of sludge against buckets, the scraping of tools against stone, the grunts of men heaving waste aside. The smell was ever present, sour and clinging, an invisible cloak they could never remove. Worse still was the work beneath the city. Rome's greatest achievement of engineering, the Cloaca Maxima, carried sewage out toward the Tiber. Smaller channels branched into neighborhoods, connecting latrines, baths, and gutters. These tunnels required constant cleaning, and slaves or contracted workers were sent down into the darkness with torches. Imagine crouching in a narrow passage, water lapping at your legs, your torchlight flickering against slimy walls. Around you, the echoes of dripping water mixed with the skittering of unseen creatures. A misstep could leave you submerged in filth. And yet, without men willing to enter these spaces, the system would clog, back up, and disease would spread swiftly through the city. Just as vital were the attendants of Rome's famous communal latrines. These were not private spaces, but long benches of stone with evenly spaced holes, often with running water beneath to carry away waste. Wealthy citizens might relieve themselves in relative comfort here, chatting with neighbors or listening to gossip, while attendants hovered discreetly nearby. Their duties ranged from ensuring the flow of water continued, to keeping the facilities reasonably clean, to offering a curious Roman invention, the communal sponge on a stick. This tool, used in place of toilet paper, was dipped into a water channel and reused. The attendant might be the one to fetch it, rinse it, or replace it. Imagine the humility required, tending to strangers in such an intimate and unglamorous context. And yet, these workers were essential. Without them, even Rome's finest latrines would have descended into chaos and unbearable filth. The gutter cleaners and latrine workers shared a fate similar to that of the tanners and fullers. Society needed them, but shunned them. The stench clung to their clothes, their skin, even their hair. At banquets or in temples, others might edge away from them, noses wrinkled. Yet their labor touched every citizen's life. The streets remained passable because of them. Outbreaks of pestilence were reduced because they carried waste away. Rome's shining face depended on their invisible, dirty hands. It is calming, in a way, to imagine the rhythm of their lives. Night after night, gutter cleaners trudged along the same paths, scraping, scooping, and carrying. Their bodies grew accustomed to the weight, their ears to the sounds of trickling water and distant footsteps. In the latrines, attendants stood quietly in the background, listening to the hum of conversation, the steady drip of water, the rustle of togas as citizens came and went. Think of the perspective these men must have had. While senators debated in the Curia, while generals dreamed of conquest abroad, while merchants tallied their coins, the gutter cleaner knew the city's underbelly more intimately than anyone. He saw the waste of rich and poor alike, mingled in the same streams. He knew that, stripped of finery, every Roman left behind the same traces of life. There is a strange equality in waste, and the men who labored in it may have sensed truths others preferred to ignore. At the end of the day, or more often at the end of the night, these workers emerged into fresh air. They climbed out of tunnels, left behind the shadows of drains, and stretched their sore backs beneath the open sky. Perhaps they lingered for a moment, breathing in the scent of morning bread from a nearby bakery, letting it wash away the stench that clung to them. Perhaps they walked home quietly, unnoticed by the crowds beginning their day, their labor already hidden once more beneath the surface. As you imagine them, let your mind settle into the calm flow of water through stone channels, the eternal rhythm of cleaning, clearing, and beginning again. The gutter cleaners and latrine workers remind us that beneath every glittering empire lies an undercurrent of unglamorous labor. Without them, Rome would have drowned in its own filth. With them, the city continued to shine. And so we move on, leaving behind the murky tunnels and damp benches of the latrine, stepping back into the sunlight. Ahead lies another forgotten profession, equally strange, equally necessary, waiting for us to uncover its story. Section 4. The Rat Catchers of Rome. When you picture Rome, you may imagine gleaming marble temples, statues standing tall in the sun, or senators in white togas walking proudly across the forum. But if you look closer, especially in the corners of markets, in the shadows of storerooms, or in the dark edges of cellars, you will see another presence. Small, quick, and endless in number. Rats. Rome was full of food, Grain poured in from Egypt. Olives arrived from Spain. Wine from Gaul. Markets bustled with baskets of figs, tables covered in cheese, and stalls offering salted fish. All of this food did not sit long without drawing hungry visitors. Rats darted between jars, gnawed on baskets, and chewed their way into storehouses. And with rats came disease, filth, and fear. So Rome, as with everything else, had its answer. There were men who worked as rat catchers. Their job was not glamorous, but it was needed. They crept into storerooms at night, waited near drains, and moved quietly through darkened alleys. Their eyes grew used to the dim light. Their ears learned to catch the faintest scurry of claws. They knew the patterns of the rodents better than anyone else. The tools of their trade were simple but effective. Small wooden traps with weighted lids, nets with fine mesh, easy to spring over a fleeing animal. Sometimes, small dogs or ferrets were used, slipping into holes and chasing rats into waiting hands. At times, poisons were spread, powders or herbs thought to weaken and kill the creatures. But more often, it was patience and speed that mattered most. A rat catcher had to move suddenly, with steady hands, closing a trap or snapping a net at just the right moment. Imagine him at work. The streets outside may be noisy, filled with carts and shouting vendors. But in a storeroom, the rat catcher crouches silently. A lamp burns low beside him, casting golden light across sacks of grain. He hears a faint rustle, the sound of something moving inside the sack. He waits, breath held, until a small nose pokes through a tear. Then with quick motion, the net drops. The rat squeals, thrashes, and is caught. Another pest removed. But the work was never-ending. For every rat caught, more waited nearby. They bred quickly, lived in countless holes, and found their way back into every corner of the city. The rat catcher's job was not to win, but to hold the line, keeping numbers low enough that markets and homes could function without ruin. It was a battle fought daily, and one that could never truly end. The dangers were many. Rats carried bites, and bites carried fever. They sprayed fleas, and fleas brought sickness. At times, outbreaks swept through districts, and rat catchers were sent in greater numbers to try to limit the damage. Some believed the work itself cursed. That constant contact with filth would shorten a man's life. Yet still, the job existed, and men took it. For some, there was coin to be made. For others, it was the only work offered to them. The rat catchers were both hated and respected. Hated for the smell that clung to them, the scent of damp, of fur, of death. Respected, because people knew that without them, the city's food would not last. Merchants, in particular, relied on their services, hiring them to watch over storerooms, to clear out infested cellars, or to patrol the docks where grain ships unloaded their precious cargo. At times, children may have followed them through the streets, watching with a mix of fear and fascination as they carried cages filled with squirming bodies. The squeaks and scratches inside were unsettling, yet impossible to look away from. Rat catchers lived with these sounds daily, treating them as ordinary. For them, the writhing cage was not horror, but proof of a job completed. Picture the rhythm of their lives. At dusk, when others returned home, rat catchers often began their work. They walked quietly through narrow alleys, lanterns swinging at their sides. They carried nets and traps on their backs, wooden cages banging softly as they moved. When they reached a market or storehouse, they crouched low, waiting for movement, listening to the night. Hours passed slowly, broken only by the sudden snap of a trap or the muffled squeal of a catch. It is strangely soothing to imagine the quiet of the night, the steady breathing, the soft shuffle of straw in storerooms. The rat catcher sits patiently, alert but calm, his senses tuned to the faintest sound. It is not glamorous, not pleasant, but it has a kind of meditative rhythm. Each motion is simple: wait, listen, spring, catch. Again and again, until the night gives way to dawn. In the morning, the rat catcher might empty his cages, dispose of bodies, and clean his tools. He might wash in a fountain, scrubbing hands that always smelled faintly of fur and waste. Then, weary but steady, he would return home to sleep, ready to begin again when night fell once more. Rome's greatness depended on these quiet, unseen labors. Without rat catchers, food would have spoiled, disease would have spread faster, and daily life would have become unbearable. They lived in the shadows, hunted in silence, and worked while others rested. Yet their strange profession was one of the many hidden pillars holding up the empire. And so, as we leave this dim storeroom behind, the lamplight fades, the sounds of squeaks and scratching soften, and the air grows lighter. Outside, the city hums with life, unaware of the men who kept it safe from the creatures in the dark. We walk on, calm and steady, toward the next strange Roman profession, waiting for us just ahead. Section 5. The Corpse Collector, a grim duty in the Eternal City. In the shining marble streets of Rome, where emperors paraded and crowds cheered in the Colosseum, there existed an entirely different kind of worker. One who never stood in the limelight, who never received applause, and whose labor was considered both shameful and necessary. These were the libitinari, the corpse collectors of ancient Rome, men tasked with the grim responsibility of removing the forgotten dead from the city. If you think their modern job is tough, this was one occupation you truly would not have survived a single day at. Death was everywhere in Rome. Though we often picture the city as a glittering capital of empire, it was also a crowded, noisy, and dirty metropolis of over 1 million people at its peak. Sanitation was limited, disease outbreaks were frequent, and life expectancy was short. The poor, the enslaved, and those without family support often died without anyone to claim them. When that happened, it fell to the corpse collectors to handle the bodies and transport them away from the bustling city. The work was physically punishing. Imagine lifting a lifeless body from a cramped one-room apartment, carrying it down narrow staircases, or hauling it from an alley where it had been left exposed. The collectors rarely had proper tools or equipment to ease their labor. Much was done by hand. They carried corpses on wooden stretchers or dragged them into carts, often without protective clothing. The risk of injury or infection was constant. A single cut or scrape could lead to a fatal illness when handling the body of someone who had died of plague or fever. Yet these men had no choice. It was their livelihood, however grim. Beyond the sheer physical strain, there was the natter of the senses. Ancient writers describe how corpse collectors were haunted by the stench of decay, a smell that clung to their clothing, their hair, even their skin. Without soap as we know it today, or access to regular bathing beyond public baths, the smell never truly left them. They became quite literally marked by their work. People could identify a corpse collector not by his face, but by the odor he carried. Imagine living your life knowing that others could smell your profession before you even spoke a word. Socially, the role was despised. In Roman culture, contact with the dead was considered polluting. Families who buried their relatives performed cleansing rituals afterward, washing themselves and sometimes even their houses to remove the taint of death. But corpse collectors lived in that state permanently. They were considered ritually impure. And that stigma meant they were often shunned from mainstream society. They did not attend festivals or mingle with respectable citizens. They lived at the margins, viewed with suspicion, disdain, or even fear. The destinations for their grim cargo were no less dreadful. While the wealthy dead were honored with tombs, sarcophagi, and elaborate funeral processions, the poor were consigned to mass graves known as pudicili. These were massive pits outside the city walls where bodies were dumped in layers, covered with thin amounts of soil or lime, and left to decompose together. The collectors were responsible for depositing the bodies into these pits, sometimes dozens in a single day. One can imagine the scenes: flies buzzing, the earth shifting underfoot, the sight of countless human forms reduced to anonymity in the ground. Working in the pudicili exposed the collectors to yet more horrors. The pits emitted foul gases, dangerous to breathe. Decomposition attracted vermin and scavenger animals. Some accounts suggest that corpse collectors themselves often died young, succumbing to the very diseases and conditions they were exposed to daily. In truth, their job was a form of slow destruction, a profession that consumed them body and soul. And yet their work was indispensable. Without them, bodies would have piled up in homes, alleyways, and public spaces, spreading disease and creating unimaginable chaos in the city. They performed one of the most vital public health services of their time, but received no glory, no gratitude, and certainly no reward beyond meager pay. It is a stark contrast to the way Rome celebrated its soldiers, gladiators, and politicians. The corpse collectors worked invisibly, their labor ensuring that life in the capital could continue uninterrupted. Psychologically, the burden must have been immense. To live day after day among the dead, to see life snuffed out repeatedly, to carry the weight of so many nameless souls, it would have been enough to break the spirit of even the strongest among us. Perhaps that is why Roman sources often describe these men as hardened, emotionless, and detached. It was a survival mechanism. To endure their duties, they had to build walls within themselves, separating their humanity from their work. It's worth remembering, too, that in Rome's hierarchy, everything about this job screamed powerlessness. A corpse collector could not choose his clients. He was summoned by officials or landlords when a death occurred. He could not refuse the labor, no matter how gruesome. And because of his association with impurity, he had no avenue to climb socially or escape his station. Unlike a gladiator who might win fame in the arena, or a soldier who might earn citizenship, the corpse collector was locked into his fate. It was a profession with no ladder, only decline. When we picture Rome, we often think of grandeur, triumphal arches, golden palaces, and proud legions marching in perfect formation. But beneath that veneer was the hidden machinery that kept the city alive. The corpse collectors were part of that machinery, a reminder that even in the greatest of civilizations, someone had to deal with the darkest realities of life. Their story forces us to look past the marble facades and confront the fact that empire was built not only on glory, but also on toil, sacrifice, and unspeakable hardship. If given the chance, could you survive a single day in their sandals, carrying bodies under the scorching Mediterranean sun, inhaling the fumes of decay, bearing the weight of society's disgust while performing its most necessary task? For most of us, the answer is simple: absolutely not. And perhaps that's what makes this job one of the strangest and most unbearable of all in ancient Rome. Section 6. The Tanners, masters of stench and skin. Among the many trades that supported the bustling Roman Empire, few were as vital and as revolting as tanning. Without tanners, there would have been no leather for soldiers' boots, no harnesses for horses, no belts, no water skins, and no leather armor for those fighting on the empire's distant frontiers. Yet, despite its importance, tanning was regarded as one of the foulest professions imaginable. The process was grueling, filthy, and suffused with odors so overwhelming that even Romans, accustomed to the constant smells of sewage, sweat, and smoke, turned up their noses. The tanner's workshop, or tannery, was always placed at the very edge of town, far away from villas, temples, and markets. This wasn't by accident. Roman law often forced these trades to remain outside city limits, both for health reasons and because no one wanted to live downwind of the stench. If you were walking toward a tannery, you would smell it long before you saw it, a pungent mixture of rotting animal flesh, fermenting urine, and acrid smoke. The air would cling to your lungs, your clothes, and even your hair. The process of tanning began with raw animal hides, mostly from cattle, goats, and sheep. These hides arrived fresh from the butcher, heavy with fat, flesh, and blood. The first step was to soak them in vats of water mixed with lime or ash, softening the skin and loosening any remaining hair. Workers scraped the hides by hand, pulling off clumps of hair and slivers of tissue with crude knives. This was exhausting work, requiring both strength and patience. The hides were heavy, slippery, and gave off a nauseating stench as they decayed in the heat. But the worst part was yet to come. To turn stiff hides into supple leather, tanners needed a natural chemical agent that would both preserve and soften the skin. Their solution was ingenious but revolting: human and animal urine, collected in large jars placed throughout the city. Yes, Romans actually had designated pots for this purpose. Urine was delivered to the tanneries in bulk. Workers stomped hides in vats of the liquid, much like grapes were stomped in winemaking. The ammonia in urine helped break down fats and proteins, making the leather pliable. Imagine standing barefoot in such a vat. The liquid warm under the Mediterranean sun, the fumes rising around you. This was the daily reality of the Roman tanner. Even after this stage, the hides required more treatment. They were rubbed with mixtures that often included animal brains, fats, and oils. In some recipes, the brains of the very animal whose hide was being tanned were used, as Romans believed every animal had just enough brains to tan its own hide. Whether true or not, it made the process even more gruesome. Once softened and preserved, the hides were stretched and dried, sometimes smoked over fires, until they became the leather that clothed, equipped, and armed the Roman population. The health risks for tanners were immense. Prolonged exposure to lime and ammonia could burn the skin and damage the eyes. Cuts sustained while scraping hides could easily become infected. The constant inhalation of noxious fumes weakened lungs and shortened lives. Roman medical texts occasionally mention workers in leather trades as suffering from chronic illness and premature aging. It was not just a job, it was a slow erosion of the body. Socially, tanners bore a stigma almost as deep as corpse collectors. They were considered unclean, their constant contact with decay and filth marking them as undesirable neighbors or friends. In Roman social hierarchies, purity mattered. Occupations involving filth or death, tanners, butchers, gravediggers, were grouped together at the bottom, shunned by polite society. Wealthy Romans would never dine with a tanner, nor would they allow one to live in their quarter of the city. Yet despite their low status, tanners had undeniable importance. The Roman army marched on leather boots. Their shields were bound with leather straps, and their horses wore leather tack. Farmers used leather harnesses. Sailors relied on leather rigging, and every household owned leather goods of some kind. Without tanners, Rome's vast infrastructure would have ground to a halt. This tension between society's dependence on the trade and its disdain for the workers defined the life of a Roman tanner. Psychologically, one wonders how these men endured. Day after day, immersed in foul liquids, rejected by their neighbors, and laboring in punishing conditions, it must have required immense resilience. Perhaps they grew numb to the smells, the same way a corpse collector grew numb to death. Perhaps they took quiet pride in knowing that, however much others despised them, their work kept Rome functioning. Or perhaps they simply had no choice, bound to their trade by necessity, family tradition, or economic desperation. Even the simple act of returning home from work carried humiliation. A tanner could not hide who he was. The smell betrayed him instantly. Ancient sources describe how workers in such trades were unwelcome in public baths, since their presence fouled the water. Imagine being denied even the comfort of bathing, a key part of Roman social life, because of your profession. For a Roman tanner, isolation was not just physical, it was woven into the very fabric of their existence. And yet, in this misery, there is also a strange testament to human adaptability. The tanners found ways to survive, to carry on their work despite its horrors, and to contribute to an empire that would never celebrate them. When you think of Roman soldiers clashing on distant battlefields or senators reclining on leather couches in marble villas, remember that behind these images was a small, despised class of workers, knee-deep in urine and filth, turning waste into utility. They embodied the paradox of ancient labor, indispensable yet invisible, essential yet reviled. For the modern reader, the job of a Roman tanner is almost unthinkable. Could you stand the stench? Could you stomach the sight of hides crawling with maggots before they were processed? Could you endure the burns, the sores, the endless rejection by your community? Most of us would flee after a single day, but the tanners of Rome endured a lifetime of it. They remind us that empires are not built only by generals and emperors, but also by those who labored in shadows, transforming death and waste into tools of survival. Section 7. The latrine cleaners, guardians of Rome's sewers. The Romans were proud of their aqueducts and baths, marvels of engineering that symbolized cleanliness and civilization. But what went in must also come out, and so beneath the bustling streets of Rome lay another marvel, the sewer system, with its crown jewel, the Cloaca Maxima. These underground arteries carried away waste, keeping the city livable for millions. Yet while the aqueduct builders and bath architects were celebrated, another group toiled in silence and filth, the latrine cleaners and sewer workers. The public latrine, or foraca, was a social hub as much as a necessity. Long stone benches, often carved with neat round holes, lined the rooms. Beneath them, flowing water carried away waste into the sewers. On the surface, it seemed civilized, almost elegant, but this apparent cleanliness was an illusion. The benches quickly became caked with grime. The air grew heavy with ammonia and methane. Flies buzzed incessantly, and beneath the stone floors, the true horrors collected. Someone had to descend into those depths, clearing blockages and maintaining the flow of the city's underbelly. That task fell to the cleaners. Their work was both dangerous and degrading. Armed with little more than shovels, hooks, and buckets, they climbed down into the cellars, where they waded waist-deep in human waste. Imagine the darkness, broken only by the flicker of oil lamps, the stench pressing into your skin and lungs until it became almost impossible to breathe. The walls were slick with slime, rats scurried in the shadows, and strange insects thrived in the damp. To modern minds, it sounds unbearable. For these workers, it was daily life. One of the greatest dangers was collapse. The tunnels were ancient, prone to cave-ins. A sewer worker might be crushed by falling stones, his body never recovered, simply left in the filth he had spent his life clearing. Poisonous gases posed another threat. Without warning, methane could build up and ignite from a stray lamp, or suffocate a worker before he had a chance to escape. There are even accounts suggesting that creatures lurked in the depths: snakes, massive rats, and once in a while, crocodiles kept as exotic pets and then abandoned, which grew monstrous in the sewers. Whether fact or rumor, such stories fueled the terror of going underground. Above ground, the cleaners also tended to the latrines themselves. They scrubbed the benches, drained stagnant water, and managed the sponge sticks, tersoria, used by patrons in place of toilet paper. These communal sponges were rinsed in buckets of salt water or vinegar, but the task of ensuring their cleanliness fell to the workers. The reality was grim. Infections spread easily, and the workers themselves often carried sores and illnesses from their constant contact with waste. Socially, their position was as low as one could imagine. To be associated with human filth marked a person as untouchable in polite society. They were essential, and yet despised. Romans liked to speak proudly of their clean water and advanced hygiene, but they rarely acknowledged the laborers who made it possible. A senator could boast of Rome's aqueducts while refusing to meet the eyes of the man who scrubbed his local latrine. The irony is that the work of these cleaners protected the health of the city. Without them, waste would have backed up, disease would have spread, and the shining image of Rome as a clean, ordered civilization would have collapsed. Their invisible labor kept the streets from overflowing with filth, allowing the wealthy to live in comfort and luxury. One can imagine the psychological toll. To spend every day immersed in waste, to know that society saw you as little more than the muck you cleared, must have been crushing. And yet, perhaps there was pride in their endurance. Perhaps they took quiet satisfaction in knowing they served a role no one else dared to touch. In the darkest corners of the Cloaca Maxima, they were the unseen guardians of Rome's cleanliness. If you pause for a moment and picture it, the dripping tunnels, the constant smell, the flickering lamplight, the weight of silence broken only by the drip of water, you may wonder how anyone could survive such work. Most of us would not last a single hour. Yet these men returned day after day, year after year. In the grand story of Rome, their names are forgotten, but their toil made possible the splendor above. Section 8. The Garbage Collectors, keeping Rome from drowning in its own waste. In the streets of ancient Rome, life was loud, bustling, and colorful. Merchants shouted over the clatter of carts, children ran between stalls, and the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scents of fish and herbs. Yet alongside the vibrancy of daily life was a less pleasant reality: mountains of waste. Food scraps, broken pottery, animal bones, and household refuse piled up quickly, especially in crowded neighborhoods. Someone had to manage it. That someone was the garbage collector. These workers, often called scavengers or collectores, were among the lowest in Roman society, yet their role was vital. Without them, the streets would have become impassable. The odor of decaying food and animal remains would have overwhelmed the city, spreading disease and attracting vermin. Their work prevented filth from taking over and allowed Rome to function, keeping markets and homes navigable and relatively clean. Garbage collection was not organized like modern waste management. There were no trucks or formalized schedules. Instead, scavengers patrolled districts, sometimes under the authority of the aediles, officials responsible for maintaining public order and sanitation. They carried large baskets or sacks, climbing stairs and weaving through alleys, gathering refuse from homes, taverns, and market stalls. The loads were heavy and often filled with sharp bones, broken ceramics, and spoiled food. Handling it required both strength and careful attention. The streets themselves presented hazards. Cobblestones were uneven, carts rumbled over narrow paths, and waste sometimes overflowed into gutters. Rain turned refuse into a slick, smelly sludge. Garbage collectors worked through all of it, balancing their baskets, moving swiftly to avoid spilling their load. When a sack tore or a basket tipped, the contents fell to the ground, creating an even bigger mess to clean up, and the stench became nearly unbearable. The types of refuse varied widely. Organic waste included vegetable peelings, leftover bread, animal offal, and discarded fish. Broken pottery, worn-out clothing, and damaged wooden tools formed the inorganic portion. In wealthier neighborhoods, garbage might contain scraps of luxury items, tiny fragments of glass, shards of silver, or pieces of jewelry thrown away in haste. Yet the collectors treated all waste alike, combining it into massive piles ready to be transported away. Where did the garbage go? Often to the edges of the city, near the Tiber, or into pits dug specifically for waste. Some refuse was burned, producing a faint smoke that drifted over the city. Other materials were recycled in rudimentary ways. Bones might be crushed for fertilizer, old textiles reused, and broken pots melted down for clay. Still, the majority was simply removed, dumped into areas far from residential quarters. The collectors bore the responsibility for ensuring that nothing rotted where it could cause harm to the living. Their work was not only physically demanding, but also hazardous to health. Rotten food attracted rats, which carried fleas and disease. Sharp objects could cut hands and feet. Heavy loads caused muscle strain and chronic pain. Exposure to filth meant constant risk of infection. It is remarkable to imagine that these workers survived day after day under such conditions, maintaining a city as grand and populous as Rome. Socially, garbage collectors were marginalized. They lived on the fringes, often in neighborhoods where few other citizens wished to reside. Their clothing and skin were perpetually stained with grime. They were avoided by wealthier citizens, treated as unclean, and sometimes referred to in derisive terms. Despite the essential nature of their work, they were considered undesirable and even feared in some quarters. Yet there was a strange rhythm and routine to their labor. Each morning or evening, they moved systematically through the streets, silent but steady, lifting, gathering, and transporting. The clatter of their baskets and the occasional smell were constant reminders to citizens that sanitation was happening quietly in the background. Their movements were almost meditative. Lift, sweep, carry, deposit, repeat. In this repetition, there was both endurance and a peculiar calmness, a rhythm that kept the city moving while most inhabitants went about their lives unaware. Imagine walking through Rome at night and catching sight of these collectors, hunched over, their arms full of refuse, their eyes scanning for anything left behind. Perhaps a stray loaf of bread, a broken pot, a fragment of vegetable. They worked with attention and precision, knowing that even a single neglected pile could draw rats or produce disease. Their labor was invisible in the grand stories of Rome, yet absolutely critical to daily life. In the end, garbage collectors exemplify a paradox of ancient Rome. They were indispensable yet scorned, constantly exposed to the city's most unpleasant aspects, yet ensuring the survival and comfort of millions. Without their toil, the beauty and grandeur of Rome would have been impossible, swallowed under its own filth. They were silent custodians of order, the invisible hands that kept civilization functioning amidst chaos. And so, as we imagine them leaving, the last of the evening's collection behind, their work done for the night, the streets clear once more, we can appreciate the dedication and endurance required. The scent fades, the streets appear clean, and the city continues on, unaware of the quiet guardians who made it possible. Their presence is invisible, their contribution enormous, and their life a testament to human resilience in the face of the unpleasant. Section 9. The Rat Hunters, Rome's Unseen Pest Controllers. Beneath the grandeur of Rome's marble temples and bustling marketplaces lurked a constant problem: rats. These small, nimble creatures thrived in the city's food markets, sewers, and granaries, feeding on leftovers, grain stores, and even discarded scraps from households. The rat population was so persistent that the Romans had to rely on specialized workers, rat hunters, to keep the vermin in check. Without them, disease and damage would have spread through the city with alarming speed. Rat hunters were not esteemed in society, yet their labor was essential. These workers navigated the city's alleys, abandoned buildings, and storage areas, tracking and trapping rats before they multiplied unchecked. They carried long sticks, nets, and occasionally hooks to flush the creatures out of hiding. Some used ferrets or specially trained dogs to flush and capture rats in tight spaces, while others relied on clever traps baited with food. Their work required patience, quick reflexes, and a tolerance for the squeaks, scratches, and sudden movements of frightened animals. The environment in which they operated was often grim. Granaries could be dusty and dark, with heaps of grain providing perfect nesting grounds. Alleyways smelled of rotting food, sewage, and refuse. Rat hunters frequently had to bend, crawl, and squeeze into tight spaces to reach infestations. The constant presence of vermin meant bites and scratches were common, and the risk of disease was ever present. Plague, typhus, and other infections spread quickly through rat populations, and hunters were exposed daily. Many rat hunters worked alone, relying on experience and intuition. They developed a keen sense for where rats hid, listening for the faintest scratching or scurrying sounds. They noticed signs invisible to the untrained eye: gnawed wood, droppings, tracks in dust, and holes in walls or floors. Each hunter had a rhythm and method, moving silently through a building or street, guided by a combination of skill and instinct. Their work was both meticulous and exhausting, requiring constant attention to detail. Despite the dangers, rat hunters had a strange sense of satisfaction in their success. Trapping a particularly large or clever rat was considered an achievement. In some areas, hunters were paid per rat, incentivizing diligence and patience. The work provided a livelihood, though it was dirty, often smelly, and socially marginalizing. Citizens preferred not to think about these workers, yet they were crucial in protecting homes, markets, and grain stores from destruction. Rome's storage of grain and food was vital to feeding its population, and unchecked vermin could ruin the city's food supply. Rat hunters, therefore, served not just as pest controllers but as silent protectors of public health. Their labor ensured that the grain ration to soldiers and citizens remained safe to eat, and that disease-carrying vermin were limited in number. They worked quietly, often unnoticed, yet their impact was tangible and critical. The psychological strain of their profession was considerable. Constant exposure to disease, dark and cramped spaces, and the relentless activity of rats created a demanding environment. Some hunters developed routines to cope: smoking herbs to mask the smell, carrying vinegar or oils to disinfect hands and clothes, and performing daily rituals of cleaning after work. Yet even with such precautions, the job took a toll. Many hunters aged prematurely or suffered from chronic ailments caused by repeated exposure to filth and infection. Socially, rat hunters were marginalized. Their work was necessary but considered undesirable, similar to tanners or latrine cleaners. Wealthier Romans avoided interaction with them. They were often treated as unclean, and their profession carried a stigma that could not be erased. Despite this, some hunters developed a form of camaraderie with one another, sharing tips, traps, and methods for success. Their society was small but tight-knit, bound by shared knowledge and a common understanding of the hazards they faced daily. Rat hunting required both courage and cunning. The animals they pursued were fast, clever, and sometimes aggressive. Hunters needed to anticipate movements, block escape routes, and think several steps ahead to succeed. There was no room for error. A single miscalculation could result in injury, a missed catch, or contamination of the area. Each day was a careful balance of skill, observation, and endurance. The work of rat hunters, like many other unpleasant jobs in Rome, was essential to the functioning of the city. While citizens enjoyed the comforts of clean streets, stocked granaries, and functioning homes, they seldom considered the labor that made these comforts possible. Rat hunters were invisible guardians, keeping vermin populations manageable and protecting the health and well-being of the community. Without them, the thriving metropolis of Rome would have been overrun, and its daily life far more chaotic. And so, as the hunter left a dark granary or alleyway, the city above unaware, we can appreciate the quiet, essential work performed in shadow. The squeaks and scuttles of rats faded behind him, the streets remained free from infestations, and the grain continued to nourish the people. Rat hunters worked in silence, yet their labor allowed Rome's grandeur to shine uninterrupted. They endured filth, danger, and social disdain, all to maintain a fragile balance between human civilization and nature's ever-present chaos. Section 10. The Sewer Divers, brave souls beneath the streets. Beneath the marble facades and busy streets of Rome ran a hidden network of water and waste. Aqueducts carried fresh water to fountains and baths, while sewers like the Cloaca Maxima drained the city's filth. Maintaining these systems was essential for public health, yet it required a type of labor few could imagine enduring: sewer diving. The divers, sometimes called urinari or cloacari, were men who descended into dark, fetid tunnels, submerged in waste to keep the city's plumbing flowing. The work was physically demanding. Divers waded through waste, or sometimes chest-deep water, which was a mixture of rain runoff, sewage, and other refuse. The water carried disease, chemicals from tanneries, and rotting food. They carried long hooks, nets, and spades to remove clogs, debris, and sometimes even corpses. Every step required balance and care. The tunnels were slippery, uneven, and often littered with hidden obstacles. One wrong move could lead to injury or a dangerous fall. The air in these tunnels was thick with a combination of gases. Methane, ammonia, and the stench of decomposition made breathing difficult. Divers often felt dizzy or nauseous, yet they had to persist, guided only by flickering oil lamps or daylight from occasional openings. The darkness amplified every sound: water dripping, rats skittering, the echo of their own movements. It was a disorienting, oppressive environment, demanding courage and focus beyond most people's capacity. The dangers went beyond the physical. Contact with sewage carried an immense risk of infection. Cuts could become septic, and exposure to contaminated water often led to fever, dysentery, or other illnesses. Protective clothing was minimal, typically just simple tunics or sandals, so the diver's skin was exposed to filth constantly. Many did not live long lives. Roman texts occasionally note how laborers in sewer maintenance suffered chronic ailments or died prematurely from the hazards of their work. Yet the necessity of the work could not be overstated. The sewers carried away human-waste, household refuse, and stormwater, preventing flooding and contamination in the city. If debris clogged the channels, streets and homes would flood, spreading filth and disease. Sewer divers were, in effect, the unseen guardians of public hygiene. Every day they worked to ensure that Rome's water systems remained functional, that the fountains and baths above flowed freely, and that the city could continue operating as an ordered, livable metropolis. The diver's life was not easy socially. Their work was despised by polite society, just as tanners and latrine cleaners were considered ritually impure. Sewer divers were associated with filth and danger. Wealthy Romans avoided contact, and the laborers themselves often lived near the tunnels they maintained in marginal districts of the city. Their profession was necessary but shunned, and their courage went unnoticed by the majority of the population. Despite this, sewer divers developed skills and knowledge unique to their trade. They learned to navigate tunnels instinctively, memorizing the layout of intricate underground networks. They knew which sections were prone to collapse, where blockages were likely to occur, and how to manipulate tools in confined spaces. This expertise allowed them to work efficiently and survive in a hostile environment that would overwhelm any untrained person. There was also an element of stealth and timing. Divers had to enter the sewers when the risk of flooding or sudden water surges was minimal. They coordinated their work to avoid accidents and sometimes worked in pairs or small groups for safety. Despite the dangers, they approached their labor methodically, treating each tunnel and channel as a series of challenges to be overcome, rather than merely an unpleasant chore. Psychologically, the work demanded endurance and a certain detachment. Days spent in darkness, surrounded by filth and disease, could weigh heavily on the mind. Some divers may have developed routines or rituals to cope, cleaning carefully afterward, chanting quietly, or working with steady, repetitive motions to maintain focus. This repetition, while exhausting, could also create a meditative rhythm, a way to survive the mental strain of their environment. The contributions of sewer divers were invisible but vital. Their work allowed citizens to live above ground with clean streets and functional plumbing. Their labor protected health, prevented the spread of disease, and maintained the flow of the city's essential services. Without them, Rome's image as a thriving, orderly empire would have been impossible. So, as you imagine the divers emerging from a tunnel, dripping wet and coated in grime, remember their unseen influence. They faced darkness, filth, and danger daily, yet their efforts ensured the city above could flourish. Rome owed much to these quiet, brave laborers, whose courage and endurance remained hidden beneath the very streets that bore the weight of empire. Section 11. The Tallow Makers, Turning Fat into Necessity. In ancient Rome, life was a mixture of beauty and necessity. Marble temples gleamed in the sun, public baths offered comfort, and markets overflowed with colorful fruits and fragrant spices. Yet behind this grandeur was a series of essential trades, many of them unpleasant, that kept the city functioning. Among these were the tallow makers, laborers who transformed animal fat into products that the city could not live without: candles, soap, and grease for lamps. Their work was crucial, though often ignored by those enjoying its results. The process of making tallow began with raw fat, usually collected from pigs, cows, or goats. But it was not just fresh fat that tallow makers used. They also salvaged scraps of leftover fat from butcher shops, kitchens, and markets. Every ounce counted. The fat was boiled slowly in large cauldrons to separate the solid wax-like tallow from the liquids and impurities. The boiling was done over open fires, releasing an acrid smell that clung to the air and the workers. The odor, a combination of rancid fat and smoke, was potent enough to keep tallow makers at the edge of town or in enclosed courtyards. Handling the fat was a physically demanding task. It required lifting heavy vats, stirring constantly, and skimming off impurities while avoiding burns. The liquids were hot, often bubbling violently, and contact with skin could result in painful scalds. Protective clothing was minimal, often just tunics and simple sandals, leaving the arms and legs exposed. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and incredibly dirty, yet it needed to be done carefully. Poorly rendered tallow would spoil quickly or produce a low-quality product, undermining the labor of days. Tallow makers also faced health risks beyond burns. The rancid fat emitted fumes that irritated eyes and lungs. Constant exposure led to respiratory issues, headaches, and fatigue. Cuts or abrasions could become infected quickly in the greasy, unsanitary environment. Long hours bent over vats and fires often caused back and joint pain, making the labor as physically punishing as it was smelly. Despite these hardships, tallow makers persisted. Knowing their trade provided goods essential to Roman daily life, Candles made from tallow were a primary product, essential for both households and public buildings. In a city without electric light, illumination depended entirely on the careful burning of these candles. Soap, also made from tallow combined with ashes or plant oils, allowed for cleaning clothes, scrubbing floors, and sometimes even personal hygiene. Grease was used in machinery, for lubricating chariot wheels or leather-working tools. In essence, the tallow makers' labor underpinned the very functioning of Rome, enabling citizens to live, work, and navigate the city safely. The social perception of tallow makers mirrored that of other trades involving filth. Their work was necessary but considered lowly. Citizens preferred not to linger near the pungent smells or messy courtyards where fat was rendered. Tallow makers were often treated as unclean, their profession stigmatized, and their presence generally ignored. Yet they held a certain quiet pride in their craft. Without them, the lamps would go dark, soap would be scarce, and daily life would become more difficult. Their labor, though invisible, was indispensable. In addition to physical labor, the trade required knowledge and skill. Tallow makers needed to judge the quality of fat, control the boiling temperature precisely, and know when the product was ready for molding or storage. A poor batch could be hard, brittle, or quickly spoil. They also understood the mixing of additives to improve scent, texture, or burning quality. This expertise, passed down through apprenticeships, made the difference between a successful workshop and wasted labor. Working conditions could be monotonous, yet the rhythmic nature of the labor offered a strange, almost meditative calm. The repetitive stirring, skimming, and pouring, combined with the heat and scents of the workshop, created a world apart from the bustling streets. Tallow makers moved deliberately, following patterns refined over years. They worked in sync with fires and pots, immersed in a sensory environment that was challenging but familiar. Despite their low status, tallow makers were crucial for festivals, rituals, and religious practices. Candles illuminated temples during ceremonies. Tallow lamps guided processions at night, and grease ensured that wheels and tools functioned properly during public events. Their work was intertwined with culture, religion, and daily survival, even if the general populace seldom acknowledged it. The tallow maker's labor reminds us that civilization often relies on those willing to do the unpleasant work that others avoid. Their hands were coated with fat, their skin and clothes soaked in odors. Yet their contributions illuminated homes, enabled hygiene, and maintained the city's machinery. Without them, the grand image of Rome, its temples, streets, and daily life would not have been possible. As the day ended and tallow makers removed the last scraps from their cauldrons, the streets above remained bright and clean, households continued their routines, and life went on smoothly. The stench faded behind workshop walls, but their influence persisted, embedded in every candle, bar of soap, and greased wheel. They were unseen, essential, and enduring, quietly shaping the functioning of an empire that rarely noticed their toil. Section 12. The Latrine Cleaners, Unsung Custodians of Hygiene. In the bustling streets of ancient Rome, luxury and filth often existed side by side. Elegant homes with marble floors, decorated walls, and running water stood near crowded alleys and public latrines. The Romans prided themselves on public baths and aqueducts. Yet sanitation depended on a group of laborers whose work was unpleasant, dangerous, and essential. The latrine cleaners. They were the invisible hands that maintained public hygiene and allowed the city to function. Public latrines, or foracae, were long stone benches with holes spaced along the surface. Water constantly flowed beneath them, carrying away waste into the city's sewer system. On the surface, the latrines appeared orderly, even sophisticated. Citizens used them to socialize, discuss politics, or simply rest. But the reality underneath the stone benches was far less clean. Waste collected quickly, odors rose, and insects swarmed. Someone had to manage this unseen environment daily, and that task fell to the latrine cleaners. Their work was physically demanding. Cleaners carried long brushes, buckets, and sometimes tools to unclog blockages. They had to scrub the benches, wash the floors, and ensure the sponge sticks, called tersoria, were rinsed and ready for use. These communal sponges were reused, washed in salt water or vinegar, and placed carefully for the next patron. The cleaners' labor kept the latrines functional, yet it also exposed them to the constant presence of filth and disease. The hazards of the job extended beyond smell and dirt. The cleaners worked in cramped, wet conditions, often with little ventilation. Skin infections, respiratory issues, and gastrointestinal illnesses were common. Their hands, constantly in contact with waste, were vulnerable to cuts that could easily become infected. Occasionally, rats or insects created additional dangers. Despite these risks, cleaners endured the work because the city relied upon them. Without their labor, latrines would become unusable, streets could flood with sewage, and the city's health would deteriorate rapidly. Socially, latrine cleaners were marginalized. While essential, their profession carried a stigma. Wealthy citizens avoided them. Children were warned to stay away, and most Romans treated them with disdain. Yet in a paradox, their role was critical for the daily life of everyone, from the emperor to the lowest laborer. The cleaners existed in a world that was both necessary and despised, performing tasks that others could not imagine undertaking. The work required attention to detail and careful timing. Cleaners had to coordinate with water flow to avoid backflow or spills. They learned to recognize clogged pipes, areas prone to stagnation, and signs of structural weakness in the latrine system. They developed routines to maintain cleanliness efficiently while minimizing exposure to the worst conditions. The repetition of their work created a rhythm, a quiet meditative cadence amid the unpleasant environment. Despite the filth, some cleaners took pride in their skill, successfully clearing a blockage or maintaining a heavily used latrine gave a sense of accomplishment. Their labor preserved the health and dignity of the city, even if few citizens acknowledged it. In this way, they were silent guardians, ensuring that Rome's public spaces remained usable and that its sophisticated image of cleanliness endured. The latrine cleaners also played a role in waste management beyond the benches. They sometimes transported waste to the sewer system, ensuring that it flowed correctly and did not back up into the streets. They removed objects accidentally dropped into latrines, such as jewelry, coins, or small tools, handling them carefully to avoid contamination. Their work required both vigilance and resilience, balancing speed with thoroughness. A day in the life of a latrine cleaner began early and ended late. They worked while the city awoke, continued through midday traffic, and finished after the public spaces quieted. The smell, constant noise, and presence of filth were unavoidable companions. Yet for those who endured it, their work was steady, reliable, and indispensable. Their labor was part of the hidden infrastructure that allowed Rome to maintain its sophisticated reputation. In reflection, the latrine cleaners' contributions remind us that civilization depends on unseen labor. While temples, markets, and baths drew attention and admiration, it was these workers who prevented chaos, disease, and disorder. Their work was unpleasant, marginalized, and unrecognized, yet it upheld the very health and function of the city. They performed a service that ensured daily life could continue smoothly, unseen yet deeply impactful. As the cleaners concluded their day, the latrines appeared clean and ready for the next round of citizens. The stench lingered faintly but was contained. The benches polished, the sponges rinsed. Above ground, the city thrived, oblivious to the essential labor it performed below. These unsung custodians moved quietly, enduring the filth and danger of their profession, ensuring that Rome remained both functional and impressive. Section 13. The tanneries, turning animal hides into leather. In ancient Rome, leather was everywhere. Sandals lined the streets, belts fastened tunics, armor covered soldiers, and straps held carts together. Yet few thought about the labor behind these durable products. Tanneries, often located on the outskirts of the city, near rivers or streams, were the sites where animal hides were transformed into leather. This work was essential, unpleasant, and demanding, shaping much of Roman daily life in ways that remained invisible to most citizens. The process of tanning began with raw hides, usually from cows, goats, or sheep. The hides arrived stretched, wet, and coated in blood, fat, and hair. Tanners soaked them in water to clean off impurities and remove loose tissue. Then they treated the hides with a combination of urine, lime, and sometimes tannin from oak bark to soften and preserve the material. The chemicals and waste produced potent odors, often overpowering anyone who came near. Roman law even tried to restrict tanneries to the outskirts of the city because the smell was so unbearable. Working in the tannery was physically exhausting. Hides were heavy, often dripping with water and chemicals, and tanners had to lift, move, and stretch them repeatedly. Large vats had to be stirred, hides agitated, and materials transferred carefully to avoid accidents. The liquid chemicals could burn the skin, and prolonged exposure stained clothes, hands, and faces permanently. Protective gear was minimal, leaving workers coated in grime, chemicals, and the faint residue of animal fat. Despite the harsh conditions, tanners endured, producing leather that would last for decades. Health risks were constant. The combination of decomposing animal tissue, strong chemicals, and standing water created an environment rife with infection. Cuts or abrasions often became infected quickly, and respiratory problems were common due to fumes. Tanners developed thickened hands and calloused feet from their labor, and chronic ailments were typical among these workers. Their life expectancy was lower than that of other trades, yet the city relied heavily on their skill and endurance. The work was not just about brute force, it required careful technique and knowledge. Tanners had to recognize the quality of hides, the right concentration of chemicals, and the appropriate amount of time for soaking. Overtreating a hide could make it brittle, while undertreating could cause it to rot. They understood how to remove hair without tearing the leather, how to soften it for flexibility, and how to cure it so it could withstand use for years. Their expertise was specialized and often passed down from master to apprentice over generations. Tanneries were also social and economic hubs in their own way. Despite the unpleasantness, they created employment for several workers, hide carriers, chemical preparers, and finishers who smoothed and cut leather. Some workshops were small, family-run businesses, while others supplied entire districts or the military with vast quantities of leather. Roman soldiers, merchants, and artisans all depended on the steady output of these workshops, though few considered the labor that went into each piece. The smells and sights of the tannery made it an environment that most citizens avoided. The stench of animal waste, chemicals, and damp leather was strong enough to linger for miles. Flies swarmed over the open vats, and puddles of chemical water covered the floors. Children, visitors, and the general public were discouraged from entering. Yet for the tanners, the routine became familiar and even calming in its rhythm. Stir, soak, scrape, stretch, and repeat. Every step had a purpose and contributed to the final product. Daily life in a tannery required endurance and strategy. Workers had to pace themselves, carefully handle the heavy hides, and maintain balance in slippery, chemical-coated floors. Communication with fellow workers was essential to avoid accidents and ensure that hides moved efficiently from vat to vat. The process could take days or even weeks for a single batch, demanding consistency and attention to detail. A successful day meant that hides were prepared correctly, the workshop remained functional, and the leather produced could be trusted to last. Tanneries also had indirect influence on Roman culture and economy. Leather was a key material for footwear, armor, bookbindings, and straps. Festivals, military campaigns, and daily commerce all depended on tanners' labor. Without them, soldiers could not march comfortably, merchants could not transport goods securely, and citizens would have limited access to essential leather products. The city's infrastructure and social life were intertwined with the work of these often overlooked craftsmen. Despite their low status and the harsh conditions, tanners carried on. Their work was challenging, pungent, and unglamorous, yet necessary for the functioning of an entire civilization. Every sandal, belt, and piece of armor was a testament to their skill, endurance, and expertise. They were unseen pillars of daily life, turning animal hides into durable materials that shaped the experience of Rome's citizens and soldiers alike. As the day ended and the tanners finished the last hides, the workshop grew quiet. The pungent smell remained, but would be replaced the next day by new labor, new hides, and the same essential work. Above the streets, life continued smoothly. Unaware of the toil and expertise that made so much of it possible, the tanner's contribution was invisible, yet foundational, reminding us that civilization often depends on those willing to do the labor others avoid. Section 14. The latrine emptying teams. Rome's underground sanitation workers. Beneath the streets and busy marketplaces of Rome, sanitation was a constant concern. Public latrines and household toilets produced waste that had to be removed efficiently, or disease and stench would quickly overwhelm the city. This task fell to a group of workers known as latrine emptying teams. These men were specialized laborers who collected and transported human waste from public and private facilities to the outskirts of the city, where it was used as fertilizer or discarded. Their work was essential, unpleasant, and largely invisible to the citizens who benefited from it. The workday for a latrine emptying team began early, often before sunrise. Workers carried heavy buckets or operated small wagons filled with waste. The smell was overpowering, a constant mixture of human excrement, stagnant water, and occasional remnants of food. Protective clothing was minimal, often just tunics and simple sandals, leaving arms, legs, and faces exposed to the noxious fumes. Despite this, they moved methodically, understanding that efficiency was crucial for both their safety and the hygiene of the city. Emptying public latrines required careful planning and teamwork. Teams worked together to lift and transfer waste from stone benches into containers. They had to avoid spillage, prevent blockages, and maintain balance on often slick floors. Every action demanded attention, as the combination of weight, smell, and tight spaces made the job both physically and mentally challenging. Even minor accidents could result in injuries or contamination of streets and homes. The latrine emptying teams also worked with household toilets, particularly in wealthier homes. These private facilities were often more elaborate, but they too needed regular maintenance. Workers had to navigate enclosed spaces, carry heavy loads, and sometimes deal with unexpected hazards like broken pipes or hidden obstructions. Despite the discomfort, they approached the task with precision, understanding that proper disposal prevented disease and ensured the city's smooth operation. The physical demands were severe, lifting heavy buckets, hauling waste over long distances, and working in awkward positions for extended periods caused fatigue and physical strain. Repeated exposure to waste and water made cuts, abrasions, and infections common. Respiratory issues were frequent, as the odor and gases in enclosed areas could be harmful. Yet these workers continued their labor, aware that their efforts maintained both public health and the appearance of cleanliness above ground. Socially, latrine emptying teams were marginalized. Their work was necessary, but they were often avoided or treated with disdain. Citizens recognized the importance of sanitation, but preferred not to acknowledge the laborers responsible for it. Despite the social stigma, these teams developed a sense of pride in their role. They knew that without their work, streets, homes, and public latrines would become unsanitary and unsafe, threatening the city's well-being. The team's labor required skill and knowledge. They needed to navigate the city efficiently, understanding the location of latrines, the flow of sewers, and the safest routes to transport waste. They coordinated with water systems to prevent backflow and overflow, carefully timing their work to avoid disruptions. Their expertise was crucial for maintaining order and hygiene, ensuring that the city's infrastructure functioned without interruption. Daily routines included rigorous cleaning and maintenance. Tools, buckets, and wagons had to be washed and sanitized to the extent possible. Workers developed methods to reduce odor and prevent contamination, such as using lime, ashes, or water to neutralize waste. Despite their efforts, the smell lingered, marking the work as challenging and unpleasant. Over time, the repetitive motions and rituals created a rhythm, a meditative pace that helped workers endure the daily hardships. Beyond the physical labor, the work of latrine emptying teams had a lasting impact on Roman society. Waste removed from the city was often repurposed as fertilizer for crops outside urban areas. This created a cycle in which unpleasant labor contributed to food production, supporting both rural and urban populations. Their work was a quiet but essential part of the city's economy, agriculture, and health. Linking unseen labor to visible results across the empire. As the day ended, the emptying teams returned from their routes, worn and covered in filth, yet satisfied in their contribution. Streets above ground remained relatively clean, latrines functional, and citizens unaware of the dangers the workers had faced. The stench faded behind closed doors, leaving only the sense of order and hygiene that the laborers had preserved. Their work was unseen, undervalued, yet vital, a testament to the endurance, skill, and courage required to maintain civilization in a city as vast and complex as Rome. Through their perseverance, the latrine emptying teams upheld the delicate balance between cleanliness and decay, ensuring that Rome could continue its daily routines safely. Without them, life in the city would be chaotic, unsanitary, and hazardous. Though marginalized and often ignored, these workers exemplified the unseen labor that allowed one of history's greatest cities to thrive. Section 15. The Graveyard Diggers, Guardians of the Dead. In the quiet outskirts of ancient Rome, away from the bustling markets and busy streets, lay the cemeteries. Graves marked the final resting places of ordinary citizens, soldiers, and sometimes the wealthy elite. While the living went about their day above ground, graveyard diggers worked tirelessly to prepare spaces for the dead. Their labor was essential, demanding, and largely invisible. Yet it ensured that families could honor their loved ones, and the city could maintain order in death. Grave digging began with careful measurement. Workers used shovels, pickaxes, and trowels to carve out spaces in soil, rock, or sand. They had to calculate depth and width precisely, ensuring that coffins or bodies fit securely and that graves would not collapse over time. The work required focus, strength, and skill, particularly in areas with uneven terrain or hard-packed earth. Every strike of a tool was deliberate, aimed at both efficiency and safety. The physical demands of the job were significant. Digging was exhausting, especially under the Roman sun, with little shade in most cemeteries. Workers bent over repeatedly, lifting heavy earth and moving it away from the gravesite. Their hands and arms became calloused, backs stiffened, and muscles sore. Protective clothing was minimal, and they often contended with insects, snakes, and other small creatures that inhabited the soil. Despite the harsh conditions, they labored diligently, knowing that the resting place of the dead depended on their efforts. The graveyard diggers' work was closely tied to rituals and religious beliefs. Roman funerals were formal events with processions, offerings, and prayers. Digging a grave was not merely a physical task. It required understanding timing and respect for the deceased. The workers ensured that the graves were ready before the arrival of mourners, and often adjusted depth or orientation according to family requests or religious customs. Their labor was intertwined with tradition, supporting both the living and the memory of the dead. Health risks were ever present. Soil could harbor bacteria, parasites, and sharp objects, leading to cuts, infections, or illnesses. The physical strain of digging, combined with exposure to the elements, made the work taxing and sometimes dangerous. Yet, grave diggers persevered, understanding that without their labor, funerals would be delayed, and the city's cemeteries could fall into disorder. Their work maintained both hygiene and respect in spaces dedicated to the dead. Socially, graveyard diggers occupied a liminal space. They were essential, yet often regarded with suspicion or discomfort. The proximity to death, combined with the physical filth of the grave, made them a marginalized group. Families appreciated their work, but the broader society rarely celebrated it. Despite this, diggers developed pride in their skill, understanding that their careful hands preserved dignity for those who had passed and peace for those who remained. Their work required more than physical strength. Diggers needed knowledge of soil composition, drainage, and coffin placement. Misjudging depth could result in collapsed graves or flooding, while poor soil management could destabilize nearby plots. They also needed to coordinate with other laborers and funeral organizers, ensuring that each burial proceeded smoothly and respectfully. Precision, patience, and attention to detail were essential qualities for a successful day. The rhythm of grave digging could be meditative. Lifting, striking, and moving earth became a methodical process, a quiet repetition that allowed the mind to focus. In the stillness of cemeteries, surrounded by trees, tombstones, and distant birdsong, workers developed a calm awareness of the environment. The labor, while grim in its association with death, offered a quiet, reflective pace that contrasted with the chaos of the city above. Graveyard diggers also contributed to the broader maintenance of the cemeteries. They cleared debris, repaired damaged markers, and sometimes assisted with ceremonial tasks. Their work preserved both the physical integrity of burial sites and the emotional significance for families. In a society that placed importance on honoring ancestors, their labor ensured that traditions were respected and that the dead were cared for properly. As the day ended, gravediggers would cover the last mounds of earth, smooth the soil, and prepare the site for mourners. The city above continued its rhythms, oblivious to the labor below. Yet the diggers' work ensured that death was met with dignity, that graves were secure, and that families could honor their loved ones in peace. Their contribution was quiet, unseen, and essential, a testament to the hidden labor that upheld society in life and death alike. Through their endurance and skill, graveyard diggers reminded the living of the importance of respect, care, and diligence. They faced earth, exhaustion, and sometimes fear. Yet their labor allowed civilization to maintain order and honor, even in the shadow of mortality. Without them, the city's cemeteries would be chaotic, unsafe, and neglected, highlighting the unseen value of their tireless work. As our journey through the unseen and unusual labor of ancient Rome comes to a close, take a moment to breathe deeply and imagine the quiet diligence of these workers. Each trade, from sewer divers to tallow makers, latrine cleaners to grave diggers, shaped the city in ways often unnoticed. Their labor maintained hygiene, provided essential goods, and preserved the dignity of life and death. The city above thrived because of them, though their efforts remained largely invisible. Now, as you lie quietly, let the calm rhythms of their daily work settle your mind. Picture the careful, steady hands, the repetitive motions, and the silent dedication that kept Rome functioning. The narration will end soon, leaving only a sense of gentle continuity and calm. You may feel a connection to these unseen lives, their courage, and their quiet endurance. Allow yourself to drift, letting the knowledge of their steady work ease your thoughts. Sleep now, peacefully, with the understanding that every city, every civilization, rests upon the quiet dedication of those often forgotten. Good night, and may your rest be deep and calm.